The air in Courtroom 4B of the Fulton County Courthouse was thick enough to choke on. 17-year-old Darius Jackson stood before the Honorable Judge Marcus Thompson, his hands cuffed, his knuckles white. The charge? Loitering. A ridiculous, trumped-up accusation for waiting for his mom after his engineering club meeting. But Judge Thompson wasn't interested in the facts. His pale eyes, magnified by thick glasses, scanned Darius with undisguised contempt. "Another thug in the making," Thompson sneered, his voice booming. "You people are all the same, a menace to society." The words, laced with venom, echoed in the stunned silence. Darius felt the blood drain from his face. He'd seen videos of moments like this, clips of injustice that went viral, but he never imagined he'd be the one standing in the center of the frame. He was a good kid, an honor roll student, captain of the robotics team at North Atlanta High, with a full scholarship offer to Georgia Tech already on the table. He wasn't a thug. He was just a black teen in a hoodie, which, in Judge Thompson's eyes, was apparently the same thing. "Your Honor," his public defender, a young, overwhelmed woman named Sarah Jenkins, began, "My client has no prior record. He was simply waiting for his mother to pick him up. There are text messages confirming this." Judge Thompson waved a dismissive hand, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Excuses, excuses? I've heard them all." "I was just waiting for my mama," he mocked in a high-pitched, exaggerated drawl. A few of the older bailiffs chuckled, their faces weathered and indifferent. "The law is the law, son. And in my courtroom, we don't coddle criminals." The word criminal struck Darius like a physical blow. He looked out at the sparse gallery. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A woman in the front row, a reporter he vaguely recognized from a local news station, was scribbling furiously in her notepad. In the back, a teenager, no older than himself, had his phone up, discreetly recording. Darius's heart hammered against his ribs. This was real. This was happening. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Darius said, his voice quiet but firm, defying the tremor of fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "I was sitting on a bench, reading a book." He'd been halfway through a biography of Neil deGrasse Tyson, a gift from his mentor. "Reading a book?" Thompson scoffed, leaning forward. "Likely story. Probably casing the place, looking for your next victim." He slammed his hand on the bench, making everyone jump. "I'm tired of the crime in this city. I'm tired of the disrespect for authority, and I'm going to make an example out of you." Sarah Jenkins stepped forward again, her face pale but determined. "Your Honor, this is a gross miscarriage of justice. My client is a minor. This is a simple loitering charge that should have been thrown out. To speak to him this way is not only unprofessional, it's a violation of his rights." Thompson's eyes narrowed into slits. "Are you lecturing me on the law, Ms. Jenkins? You, a public defender barely out of law school? I've been on this bench for 20 years. I think I know a thing or two about justice." He turned his glare back to Darius. "Let's see what a night in juvenile detention does to your attitude. Maybe it'll teach you some respect." He raised his gavel. "This is insane," Darius whispered, the words catching in his throat. He thought of his mother, probably frantic, wondering where he was. He'd been allowed one phone call, and he'd used it to call her, his voice shaking as he explained the situation. She had been on her way, but Atlanta traffic was a beast. He looked at the judge, a man who held his immediate future in his hands, a man who had judged him based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the clothes he wore. The sense of helplessness was suffocating. He saw the gleam of satisfaction in Thompson's eyes, the look of a man who enjoyed his power, who relished the opportunity to put a young black man in his place. The courtroom doors at the back of the room swung open with a loud thud, but Judge Thompson, caught up in his tirade, didn't seem to notice. He was a predator toying with his prey. "So, what will it be, Mr. Jackson?" the judge sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you going to apologize to the court for wasting our time? Are you going to admit that you were up to no good?" Darius squared his shoulders. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had marched with Dr. King, who had faced down dogs and fire hoses for the simple right to be treated as a human being. He thought of the sacrifices made, the battles fought. He wouldn't let this man break him. "I have nothing to apologize for," Darius said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength that surprised even himself. "I am not a criminal, and I did nothing wrong." For a moment, the courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Thompson's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, contorted into a mask of pure rage. The color rose in his cheeks, a blotchy, angry red. "Insolent little punk," he hissed. He raised the gavel high, ready to bring it down to seal Darius's fate. 30 days in juvie and a $500 fine for contempt of court. The words hung in the air, a sentence of pure, unadulterated malice. Sarah Jenkins gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The reporter's pen flew across her notepad. The teenager in the back stopped recording and started typing, his fingers flying across the screen of his phone. The storm was about to break. But just as the gavel was about to fall, a new voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the tension. "Judge Marcus Thompson." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Cold, hard, and utterly confident. Everyone, including the judge, froze, turning towards the back of the courtroom. The gavel hung in mid-air, a suspended instrument of a corrupt justice. The world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. Standing in the doorway were 2 men and a woman, all dressed in sharp, dark blue windbreakers with bold yellow letters across the back. U.S. Marshal. They were an imposing presence, their faces grim and professional, their eyes scanning the room with a practiced efficiency that missed nothing. The lead marshal, a tall, broad-shouldered black man with a shaved head and a neatly trimmed goatee, held a file in his hand. He was the one who had spoken. Judge Thompson, his arm still raised, stared at them, his face a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice losing some of its bluster. "This is a closed session. I am in the middle of sentencing." The lead marshal took a step forward, his polished black shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silent room. "We are aware of that, Your Honor," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "We have official business with this court." The teenager in the back, whose name was Leo, had his phone up again, this time live streaming. He had started the stream the moment the judge began his racist tirade. His initial post on X, formerly Twitter, with the hashtag #JusticeForDarius, had already been retweeted over 1,000 times. Now, with the dramatic entrance of the U.S. Marshals, his viewer count was exploding. Comments were flying by so fast he could barely read them. "OMG, what is happening? U.S. Marshals? In a local courtroom for a loitering charge? That judge is a disgrace. He needs to be disbarred. Go get him." "Racist judge." Leo zoomed in on the Marshals, then panned to the judge's flustered face, then to Darius, who stood frozen between the 2 centers of power, his expression a whirlwind of shock and confusion. The reporter, Maria Flores, was also on her phone, sending a rapid-fire text to her editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "Get a camera crew to Fulton County Courthouse, Courtroom 4B, now. Story of the year is breaking." She knew this was more than just a judge with a bad attitude. Federal officers don't just walk into a local courtroom for no reason. Judge Thompson slowly lowered his arm, placing the gavel gently on its stand as if it were made of glass. He was trying to regain control of the situation, to project an aura of authority that was rapidly slipping through his fingers. "Official business? What kind of official business requires you to interrupt my proceedings in such a dramatic fashion?" The female marshal, A stern-looking woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun spoke this time. "We are here on behalf of the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division." A collective gasp went through the gallery. The Civil Rights Division. Those words carried weight. Serious weight. This was no longer about a teenager being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was something much bigger. Sarah Jenkins, Darius's public defender, felt a surge of adrenaline. She had been fighting a losing battle, a lone voice against a corrupt and powerful man. Now, it seemed, the cavalry had arrived. She shot a quick, reassuring glance at Darius, whose wide eyes were fixed on the federal officers. "The Department of Justice?" Thompson repeated, his voice a little shaky now. He cleared his throat, adjusting his robes. "I have not been notified of any federal investigation concerning my court." "That is because you, Judge Thompson, are the subject of the investigation," the lead marshal said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He took another step forward, stopping directly in front of the judge's bench. He opened the file he was carrying. For the past 18 months, the DOJ has been conducting a quiet investigation into a pattern of discriminatory sentencing, judicial misconduct, and civil rights violations originating from this courtroom. The room erupted in murmurs. The bailiffs, who had been laughing at the judge's jokes just minutes before, now stood stiff and silent, their faces pale. They were suddenly very aware of the part they had played, of their complicity in the judge's abuse of power. On Leo's livestream, the chat was a frenzy of activity. "Boom! He's going down! Civil Rights Division! I knew it! This dude has been a problem for years. Darius is a hero. He stood up to him." Thompson is over party. Maria Flores was no longer taking notes. She was recording everything on her phone, providing a quiet, professional narration for her news outlet's own live feed, which had just gone up. The story was spreading like wildfire. News vans were already on their way. Thompson stared at the marshal, his face ashen. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "An investigation? Based on what? The whinings of a few disgruntled criminals?" "Based on the testimony of 27 former defendants, multiple public defenders, and statistical analysis of your sentencing records over the past 5 years," the marshal replied, his voice a steady, damning litany, "which show a clear and undeniable pattern of harsher sentences for minority defendants compared to their white counterparts for the exact same offenses. We have audio recordings, we have sworn affidavits, we have a mountain of evidence, Your Honor." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he pulled a document from the file. It was thick, official, and bore the seal of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. "Marcus Thompson," the marshal said, his voice now ringing with the full authority of the federal government. "I have here a warrant for your arrest." The word arrest detonated in the courtroom. For a moment there was a stunned, absolute silence, as if the world had stopped spinning. Then, chaos. The small gallery erupted. People were on their feet, phones held high, a chorus of shocked gasps and triumphant shouts filling the air. Judge Thompson looked as if he had been struck by lightning. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The robes of his office, which moments ago had been a symbol of his power, now seemed to swallow him, making him look small and pathetic. "Arrest!" he finally managed to choke out, the word a strangled whisper. "You can't arrest me! I'm a sitting judge!" "You're a citizen accused of a crime," the lead marshal corrected him, his voice unwavering. "And no one is above the law." He gestured to his partners. "Marshal Evans, Marshal Davis, if you would." The other two marshals moved with a swift, practiced efficiency. One went around the side of the bench, while the other walked up the steps, her hand resting on the holstered weapon at her hip. The message was clear. There would be no resistance. Darius watched, his mind struggling to process the scene unfolding before him. He had come into this courtroom expecting to be humiliated, to be railroaded by a system that was designed to work against him. He had been prepared for a night in jail, for the shame and fear that would come with it. He had not, in his wildest dreams, been prepared for this. The man who had called him a thug, a menace, a criminal, was now the one being treated like one. The power dynamic had not just flipped, it had been completely and utterly shattered. The hunter had become the hunted. Sarah Jenkins stood beside Darius, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She was beaming, her eyes shining with tears of relief and vindication. "They got him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They finally got him." Marshal Davis, the woman, reached the judge. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but professional, "please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Thompson stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "This is an outrage," he bellowed, finding his voice again. "A political witch hunt. I have friends in high places. You'll all be fired for this." Marshal Evans, who had come around the side of the bench, was unmoved. "Sir, please comply," he said calmly. "Don't make this any more difficult than it needs to be." When Thompson didn't move, still sputtering threats and insults, the two marshals took hold of his arms. He flinched, trying to pull away, but their grip was like steel. With a practiced movement, they pulled him to his feet and spun him around, forcing his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs closing around the judge's wrists echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. The sound seemed to snap Darius out of his stupor. He looked down at his own cuffed hands, then back at the judge. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost overwhelming. Leo's livestream was now being watched by tens of thousands of people across the country. The hashtag #BarnchoRacistJudgeArrested was the #1 trending topic on X. Major news networks had picked up the feed, broadcasting the incredible scene live. The story of a corrupt judge in Atlanta being arrested mid-sentencing by U.S. Marshals was going global. "You have the right to remain silent," Marshal Davis recited, her voice clear and steady as she read him his Miranda rights. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Thompson, his face contorted in a mask of fury and humiliation, was no longer spewing threats. He was silent, his eyes darting around the room, seeing the cameras, the shocked faces, the undisguised glee of some in the gallery. He was seeing his life, his career, his reputation, all crumbling to dust in a matter of minutes. The lead marshal turned his attention back to the bench, addressing the stunned clerk. "The court is in recess until a new judge can be appointed," he announced. Then he looked directly at Darius. His expression, which had been hard and unreadable, softened slightly. "Mr. Jackson," he said. He walked over to the bailiff who held the key to Darius's cuffs. "Unlock him." The bailiff, a portly man who had been one of the ones snickering at the judge's remarks, fumbled with the key, his hands shaking. He unlocked the cuffs, and Darius slowly, hesitantly, brought his hands in front of him, rubbing his wrists where the metal had dug into his skin. He was free. I'm free?" Darius said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Yes, son, you are," the marshal said. "The charges against you are being dismissed. You shouldn't have been here in the first place." He paused, then extended his hand. "My name is Deputy Marshal Allen. David Allen." Darius shook his hand, a sense of surreality washing over him. "Darius Jackson. Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Allen replied, his grip firm and reassuring. "You just stood your ground. That took courage." Just then, the courtroom doors burst open again. A woman in her late 40s, her face etched with worry, rushed in. "Darius, oh my baby!" "Mom!" Darius cried. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washing over him. He ran to her, and she wrapped him in a fierce hug, burying her face in his shoulder. "I was so worried," she sobbed. I got here as fast as I could. I saw the news crews outside. I saw them arresting that man." "It's okay, Mom," Darius said, holding her tight. "It's over. It's all over." As the marshals led the now former Judge Thompson out of the courtroom, a phalanx of cameras and reporters rushed in, their flashes creating a blinding strobe effect. Microphones were thrust in Darius's face. Questions were shouted from all directions. "Darius, how do you feel? What was it like in there? Are you the one who exposed Judge Thompson?" He was overwhelmed, dizzy with the sudden, jarring shift in his reality. He looked past the cameras, past the chaos, and saw Deputy Marshal Allen giving him a small, encouraging nod. He took a deep breath. He had a story to tell. And for the first time, he knew people were ready to listen. The media frenzy outside the courthouse was even more intense. News vans from every major network lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky. Reporters jostled for position, shouting questions at anyone who came out of the building. When Darius and his mother, flanked by Sarah Jenkins, emerged, the crowd surged forward. "This way," a calm voice said. Deputy Marshal David Allen reappeared, clearing a path through the throng of reporters. He led them to a black, unmarked sedan parked at the curb. "Let's get you out of here." Inside the car, the noise of the crowd was muffled, and Darius could finally breathe. His mother still held his hand, her grip tight and protective. Sarah Jenkins sat in the front seat, talking quietly on her phone, presumably to her superiors at the public defender's office, who were likely in a state of shock. "Where are we going?" Darius's mother, Angela Jackson, asked, her voice still shaky. "A safe location," Allen replied. "There's someone who wants to meet you. Someone you should thank." Darius was confused. "Thank? I thought the Department of Justice just happened to be there today." Allen smiled, a genuine warm smile that transformed his stern face. "There are very few coincidences in our line of work, Mr. Jackson. The timing of our arrival was carefully orchestrated." He looked at Darius in the rearview mirror. "That investigation has been ongoing for a year and a half. We were building a case brick by brick. It's a slow process. But your case was the final piece of the puzzle." He explained that they had been monitoring Thompson for months, waiting for an irrefutable, public display of the bias they had already documented in private. They had a source inside the courthouse, someone who had been feeding them information. "When we learned you were on his docket today for a minor, baseless charge, we knew this was our moment," Allen said. "We knew he wouldn't be able to resist. He has a particular animosity towards young, educated black men. They challenge his worldview. He feels threatened by them. We predicted he would overplay his hand, and he did." "So you used me as bait?" Darius asked, a flicker of anger mixing with his confusion. "We put a safety net in place," Allen corrected him gently. "We were never going to let him sentence you. We were in the building before you even entered the courtroom. We just had to wait for him to commit the act in front of witnesses on the record. That boy live-streaming everything? That wasn't an accident. Our source tipped him off." The car pulled into the underground garage of a sleek, modern office building in Midtown Atlanta. They were led up to a penthouse suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city. In the center of the room, looking out at the skyline, was a man in a perfectly tailored suit. He was an older black man with graying temples and a commanding presence. When he turned around, Darius recognized him immediately. He was Nathan Pierce, the legendary civil rights attorney, a legal giant who had argued landmark cases before the Supreme Court. But he was also something else, something far more personal to Darius. "Mr. Pierce?" Darius said, his voice barely a whisper. Nathan Pierce smiled. "Darius, it's good to see you, son, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He walked over and shook Darius's hand, then nodded respectfully to his mother. "Mrs. Jackson, you're the head of my mentor program," Darius stammered, his mind reeling. "The Georgia Tech Future Leaders Initiative." "I am," Pierce confirmed. "I started it 10 years ago. We identify promising young students like you, and we try to give them every opportunity to succeed." He gestured for them to sit. "We also try to protect them." The pieces started to click into place for Darius. The mentorship program, funded by Pierce's foundation, wasn't just about scholarships and internships. It was a shield. "When you were arrested," Pierce explained, "the program was automatically flagged. I was notified within minutes. I have a few friends at the Department of Justice," he said with a significant understatement. "I made a call. I told them that one of my brightest students, a young man with a spotless record and a brilliant future, was being dragged into the courtroom of a judge they had been investigating for years. I told them the time to act was now. It was an astonishing revelation. This entire, life-altering event hadn't been a random series of fortunate events. It had been a carefully executed plan, set in motion by the quiet, powerful man standing before him. He had been protected by a network he didn't even know existed. "So, you're the source?" Darius asked Deputy Marshal Allen. Allen shook his head. "Mr. Pierce is the architect. The source was the court clerk, a brave woman who has been risking her career for months to document Thompson's abuses. She's the one who made sure Leo was in the courtroom today. She's the one who let us know when to move in." Angela Jackson looked at Nathan Pierce, her eyes filled with a profound gratitude that transcended words. "You saved my son," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your son saved himself, Mrs. Jackson," Pierce replied kindly. "He had the courage not to back down, not to be intimidated. All we did was ensure that his courage would be rewarded, not punished. We built the stage. He gave the performance of a lifetime." He turned back to Darius. "Judge Thompson saw you as a threat, Darius, and he was right. You are a threat. You and thousands of young men and women like you are a threat to an old, corrupt system that is terrified of change. Your intelligence, your ambition, your integrity. That's the real power. That's what they can't stand." He walked back to the window, looking out at the city below. Today was a victory, but it was just one battle. The war for true justice is long and hard. Thompson is just one man. There are thousands like him. But today, the whole world saw that they are not invincible. They can be held accountable. He looked at Darius, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and purpose. "The question is, what happens now? Your life has changed forever. You have a platform, a voice. People will listen to what you have to say. What will you tell them?" Darius looked at his mother, at Sarah Jenkins, at Deputy Marshal Allen, and finally at Nathan Pierce, the unseen guardian who had orchestrated his salvation. He thought of the humiliation he had felt in that courtroom, the righteous anger that had burned in his chest. He was no longer just a kid who was good at robotics. He was a symbol. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, what he had to do. The arrest of Judge Marcus Thompson sent shockwaves not just through Atlanta, but through the entire American legal system. It was one thing to read a DOJ report about judicial misconduct. It was another to see it happen live, to watch a judge be handcuffed on his own bench in the middle of a hearing. Leo's live stream, which had been picked up by every major news outlet, became the 21st century equivalent of the Zapruder film, a raw, undeniable document of abuse of power. Within hours, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia held a press conference. Standing before a bank of cameras, she laid out the charges against Thompson. A sprawling 15-count indictment that included conspiracy to violate civil rights, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The investigation had uncovered not just discriminatory sentencing, but a cash for leniency scheme involving a local bail bondsman and several private attorneys. Thompson hadn't just been a bigot. He had been running a criminal enterprise from his courtroom. The downfall was swift and brutal. Thompson's friends in high places evaporated overnight. No one wanted to be associated with such a public and toxic scandal. He was denied bail, deemed a flight risk, and held in federal custody. The image of the once powerful judge in an orange jumpsuit, his face a mask of defeated rage, became the new face of judicial corruption. The consequences radiated outward, toppling others in Thompson's orbit. The two bailiffs who had laughed at his racist jokes were immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Their careers were over. The bail bondsmen and the attorneys involved in the bribery scheme were also arrested, their offices raided by the FBI. The court clerk, who had acted as the whistleblower, was placed on paid administrative leave for her own protection and was hailed as a hero. For Darius, the world had turned upside down. He was no longer an anonymous high school student. He was a national figure. He and his mother were moved to a secure hotel, courtesy of Nathan Pierce's foundation, to shield them from the intense media scrutiny. Interview requests poured in from everyone from the local news to national talk shows. With the guidance of Pierce and a pro bono media consultant, Darius agreed to one major interview. He sat down with Gayle King for CBS Mornings. He was nervous, but as he began to speak, he found his voice. He didn't speak with anger or bitterness. He spoke with a quiet, powerful eloquence that captivated the nation. He described the feeling of being judged not for who he was, but for what he looked like. He talked about his love for engineering, his dreams of working for NASA, and the crushing feeling of having all of that nearly taken away by one man's prejudice. He wasn't just a victim. He was the embodiment of countless young black men who are systematically targeted and dehumanized by the very system that is supposed to protect them. Judge Thompson looked at me and saw a thug, Darius said, looking directly into the camera. He didn't see a student, a son, a future engineer. He saw a stereotype. And the most dangerous thing about our justice system is when the people in power can only see stereotypes. The interview was a sensation. It humanized the issue in a way that statistics and DOJ reports never could. People didn't just see a case. They saw a kid, a brilliant, hopeful kid, and they were outraged on his behalf. Donations poured into civil rights organizations. Law schools across the country reported a surge in applications, with many students citing Darius's story as their inspiration. The legal fallout for the state of Georgia was immense. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office, in conjunction with the Georgia Innocence Project, announced a full review of every single case Judge Thompson had presided over in his 20-year career. It was a monumental task, involving thousands of cases. Within weeks, the first exonerations began. People who had been railroaded, who had been given outrageously long sentences for minor crimes, began to walk free. Families were reunited. Lives that had been destroyed by Thompson's corrupt gavel were slowly, painstakingly being pieced back together. The legal community was forced into a period of deep and uncomfortable self-reflection. The State Bar of Georgia launched a task force to review judicial oversight and accountability. New rules were proposed, requiring mandatory implicit bias training for all judges and court personnel, and creating a more robust and confidential system for reporting judicial misconduct. The good old boy network that had protected men like Thompson for decades was starting to crack. Darius, watching the news from his hotel room, felt a profound sense of awe. His single, terrifying afternoon in a courtroom had become the catalyst for a sea change. He had been the stone dropped into the pond, and the ripples were spreading further than he could have ever imagined. He had thought his role in the story was over when the Marshals walked in, but he was beginning to realize it had only just begun. The world was watching, not just to see what would happen to Judge Thompson, but to see what would happen to Darius Jackson. While the public focus was on the dramatic downfall of Judge Thompson, Nathan Pierce was working quietly behind the scenes, leveraging the momentum of the moment to push for lasting, systemic change. For him, the arrest was not the end of the game. It was the opening move in a much larger chess match. He convened a meeting in the same penthouse suite where he had met with Darius. The attendees were a who's who of Georgia's legal and political establishment: the state's attorney general, the mayor of Atlanta, the chief judge of the Georgia Supreme Court, the president of the state bar, and the deans of the Emory and University of Georgia law schools. The mood was tense. They all knew why they were there. The Thompson scandal was a black eye on the entire state, and they were all under immense public pressure to do something. Pierce, ever the calm and commanding presence, let the silence hang in the air for a moment before he began. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice measured and firm. "We find ourselves at a crossroads. We can treat the Marcus Thompson situation as an isolated incident, a case of one bad apple, and move on. Or we can acknowledge it as a symptom of a deeper, more systemic disease and seize this opportunity to enact meaningful reform." He had their undivided attention. He began to lay out what he called the Darius Jackson Protocol, a comprehensive, multi-point plan for judicial reform. It was audacious, and it was brilliant. First, he proposed the creation of a new, independent civilian judicial oversight committee. This committee would be comprised not of judges and lawyers, but of community leaders, academics, and private citizens. It would have the power to investigate complaints against judges, subpoena witnesses, and make binding recommendations for disciplinary action, including removal from the bench. This was a direct challenge to the self-policing nature of the judiciary that had allowed men like Thompson to operate with impunity for so long. Second, he called for a complete overhaul of the public defender system in Fulton County, using his own foundation to provide initial seed money for a massive fundraising effort. The goal was to double the office's budget within 2 years, allowing them to hire more lawyers, reduce caseloads, and provide resources for investigators and expert witnesses. "Justice cannot be just for those who can afford it," Pierce declared. "Sarah Jenkins did a heroic job for Darius, but she is cripplingly overworked and underfunded. We need to give our public defenders the tools they need to actually fight for their clients." Third, he proposed a data-driven judicial accountability initiative. Every judge's sentencing data would be made public in a clear, accessible online database. This would allow researchers, journalists, and the public to easily identify patterns of racial or economic bias. "Sunlight," Pierce said, quoting Louis Brandeis, "is said to be the best of disinfectants." The proposals were met with a mixture of awe and resistance. The chief judge balked at the idea of a civilian oversight committee, calling it an infringement on judicial independence. The attorney general worried about the cost of overhauling the public defender system, but Pierce was prepared. He countered every objection with facts, figures, and a thinly veiled threat. "The eyes of the nation are on Georgia right now," he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "The Department of Justice is not finished with its investigation. You can either be seen as partners in reform, or you can be seen as obstacles. The choice is yours. But I promise you, this movement is not going away." He then played his trump card. He brought Darius into the room. Darius, dressed in a simple suit and tie, looked even younger than his 17 years. But when he spoke, his voice was filled with a wisdom and gravity that belied his age. He didn't talk about policy or legal theory. He talked about how it felt to be powerless. He talked about his fear, his anger, and the crushing realization that the system he had been taught to respect saw him as less than human. "You can't understand what needs to be fixed until you've listened to the people it has broken," Darius said, his voice resonating with an unshakable moral authority. "I was almost one of them. How many others weren't as lucky? How many others didn't have a Nathan Pierce or a live-streaming video to save them?" His words hung in the air, a powerful, emotional gut punch that no legal argument could counter. The room was silent. The debate was over. Over the next few months, driven by relentless public pressure and Pierce's masterful political maneuvering, the reforms began to take shape. The Georgia legislature, in a rare bipartisan effort, passed the Darius Jackson Judicial Reform Act, which included the creation of the Civilian Oversight Committee and the Public Sentencing Database. The city of Atlanta and a coalition of private philanthropies, led by a massive donation from Pierce's foundation, came together to fully fund the changes to the Public Defender's Office. It was a revolution, a quiet, procedural revolution, but a revolution nonetheless. The system that had created and protected Marcus Thompson was being dismantled, piece by piece, and rebuilt on a foundation of transparency and accountability. Nathan Pierce had not just won a battle, he was changing the entire map of the war. The world knew him as Darius Jackson, the teen who faced down a racist judge. But at home, he was just Darius, the son who still had to take out the trash and finish his calculus homework. The transition from private citizen to public symbol was a dizzying and often overwhelming experience. His face was on magazine covers, his name was in the headlines, but in the quiet moments, a profound sense of anxiety would sometimes wash over him. He had never asked for this. He had wanted to build robots, to study astrophysics, to lead a quiet life of scientific inquiry. Now, he was the face of a movement. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing at times. He would lie awake at night, reading the thousands of messages he received every day. They were from people who had suffered their own injustices, from parents who feared for their children, from young people who saw him as a hero. Their stories were heartbreaking, their faith in him humbling. His mother, Angela, was his rock. She grounded him, reminded him of who he was, and protected him from the more toxic elements of his newfound fame. "You don't have to be a superhero, baby," she would tell him, smoothing his hair. "You just have to be you. Your story is what matters. Your truth is what matters." Nathan Pierce also became a constant presence in his life, evolving from a distant benefactor to a close mentor and father figure. He understood the pressures Darius was facing because he had faced them himself as a young lawyer during the civil rights movement. "Fame is a tool, Darius," Pierce told him during one of their weekly meetings. "It can be used to build or to destroy. People are projecting their hopes and their anger onto you. The trick is not to let their projections define you. You have to define yourself." The real turning point for Darius came during the trial of Marcus Thompson. He was called as the prosecution's first witness. Walking back into that same courtroom was one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. The memories of his humiliation were still raw. But this time, everything was different. The judge was a stern but fair-minded black woman. The prosecuting attorney treated him with respect, and when he looked at the defendant's table, he saw Thompson, a shrunken, pathetic figure in a wrinkled suit, his arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed despair. As Darius recounted the events of that day, he felt a shift inside him. The fear and helplessness he had felt were replaced by a cold, clear anger. He wasn't a victim retelling a story of trauma. He was a citizen bearing witness to a crime. He spoke with a clarity and conviction that left the courtroom spellbound. He was no longer the boy who had been humiliated. He was the man who was holding his tormentor accountable. When the defense attorney tried to cross-examine him, attempting to paint him as a troublemaker who had been disrespectful to the court, Darius didn't flinch. "I was disrespectful to Judge Thompson," Darius said calmly, looking directly at the jury. "The same way a person is disrespectful to a disease. I refuse to let it consume me. I refuse to accept his version of justice because it wasn't justice. It was prejudice. And I will never ever be respectful of prejudice." It was a powerful, unscripted moment that sealed Thompson's fate. The jury was out for less than an hour. They found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. A man who had built his career on taking away the freedom of others would now spend the rest of his life without his own. After the verdict, Darius walked out of the courthouse into the bright Atlanta sunshine. This time he didn't hide from the cameras. He walked right up to the bank of microphones, Nathan Pierce and his mother by his side. "Today justice was served for Marcus Thompson," he said, his voice clear and strong. "But this was never just about one man. It's about a system that allows men like him to flourish. The work we have done here in Atlanta is just the beginning. We need a Darius Jackson Act in every state in this country. We need to fight for a justice system that is truly blind, that is fair, and that is worthy of our trust." In that moment, he was no longer a high school student who had stumbled into the spotlight. He was a leader. He had found his voice, and he had accepted the weight of his name. He still wanted to build robots. He still wanted to go to NASA. But he knew now that his life had a second, equally important mission. He would use his platform, his story, and his name to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure what he had. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of purpose. The years that followed the trial of Marcus Thompson saw a remarkable transformation, not just in Darius's life, but in the landscape of American justice. The Darius Jackson Act became a rallying cry for reformers across the nation. Activists armed with the blueprint from Atlanta began pushing for similar legislation in their own states. It was a slow, arduous process, fought tooth and nail by entrenched interests, but the tide had turned. The public had seen the rot in the system, and they were demanding change. Within 5 years, a dozen states had passed their own versions of the act, establishing civilian oversight committees and public sentencing databases. The impact was immediate and profound. Judges, knowing their records were being scrutinized, began to sentence more equitably. The glaring racial disparities in sentencing began to shrink, slowly but surely. The balance of power was shifting. Darius, true to his word, did not abandon his dreams. He attended Georgia Tech, where he excelled, earning a degree in aerospace engineering. He was a brilliant student, but he was also a dedicated activist. He spent his weekends and summers traveling the country, speaking at rallies, lobbying legislators, and sharing his story. He used the settlement he received from his wrongful arrest lawsuit against the city to create the Jackson Initiative, a nonprofit organization that provided legal aid to young people who had been unfairly targeted by the justice system. He became a unique and powerful voice for reform, able to bridge the gap between the grassroots activists and the political establishment. He could talk about the complex emotional trauma of injustice, but he could also analyze sentencing data with the precise, logical mind of an engineer. He was credible, he was charismatic, and he was impossible to ignore. The Georgia Tech Future Leaders Initiative, the program Nathan Pierce had created, became a national model. Pierce, now in his late 70s but as fiery as ever, expanded the program, opening chapters in a dozen other cities. It became a powerful network, a silent army of bright, ambitious young people of color, protected and empowered to become the next generation of leaders, scientists, artists, and reformers. Sarah Jenkins, the young public defender who had fought for Darius, became the new head of the Fulton County Public Defender's Office. With her increased budget and resources, she transformed the office into a powerhouse of zealous advocacy, attracting top legal talent from around the country. She and Darius remained close friends, often appearing together at events, a living embodiment of the change they had helped create. Deputy Marshal David Allen was promoted to the head of the Civil Rights Division for the entire Southeast region. He made it his personal mission to root out corruption and abuse of power wherever he found it. And Leo, the teenager who had live-streamed the Courtroom drama, went on to become an award-winning investigative journalist, specializing in stories of social justice. His first major documentary, Courtroom 4B, won an Emmy, and was required viewing in journalism schools. On the 10th anniversary of Thompson's arrest, Darius stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., addressing a crowd of thousands who had gathered for the March for Judicial Justice. He was no longer a 17-year-old kid. He was a man, a respected leader, a powerful force for change. 10 years ago, he said, his voice booming across the National Mall. I was a boy in a courtroom, scared and alone. But I wasn't alone. I was standing on the shoulders of giants like Nathan Pierce. I was lifted up by the courage of ordinary people who refused to be silent. What happened that day was not a miracle. It was the result of courage, accountability, and a collective refusal to accept the world as it is. We have come a long way, but our work is not done. We must continue to fight, to organize, to demand better, until the day when justice is not just a word in a courtroom, but a reality in every community, for every single one of us. As the crowd erupted in cheers, he looked out at the sea of faces, people of all races, all ages, all backgrounds, and he knew that the ripples from that one stone dropped into the pond were still spreading, growing into a wave that was changing the world. The story of Darius Jackson is a powerful reminder that one person's courage can ignite a revolution. His stand against injustice didn't just free him, it exposed a deeply corrupt system and sparked a nationwide movement for judicial reform. His journey from a terrified teen to a national leader shows that our voices have power and that true change happens when ordinary people demand accountability. The downfall of Judge Thompson wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A testament to the fact that no one is above the law and that the fight for a fair and equitable society is a fight worth waging. If this story inspired you, please like this video and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell to join our community and help us continue to tell stories that matter.